You don't truly know your neighbors until the power goes out. In daylight, with full refrigerators, running water, and a functioning police department, everyone is pleasant. Everyone waves. Everyone says underscore quote underscore zero underscore. But a blackout doesn't test manners. It tests character under pressure. And most people fail that test somewhere between day 2 and day 5. What nobody tells you is that a prolonged outage is the most brutally honest social experiment you will ever live through. It strips the performance away. It removes every comfortable mask your neighbors have been wearing for years, and what's underneath isn't always what you expected. So these are the behavioral warning signs, the patterns, the tells, the psychological red flags that reveal exactly which neighbors you cannot trust when the grid goes dark, before they prove it the hard way. Number 10. The neighbor who asks too many questions too early. Here's the first red flag, and it shows up faster than most people realize. Within the first 24 hours of a blackout, most people are confused. They're checking their phones. They're standing on porches looking up and down the street. They're disoriented. That's normal. What's not normal is the neighbor who immediately begins asking targeted questions. Not, is your power out too? But, how much water do you guys have? Not, have you heard anything? But, did you stock up before this happened? That shift from general confusion to specific resource inquiry is one of the earliest behavioral indicators of opportunistic thinking. Disaster psychologists call it premature resource mapping. It means someone has already moved past the shock phase and into the assessment phase faster than the timeline warrants. And that speed tells you something critical about how their brain is wired under stress. They're not checking on you, they're inventorying you. During Hurricane Irma's extended outages in Florida, community surveys recorded that households who reported being questioned about specific supplies within the first day were statistically more likely to experience confrontation or theft later in the outage. Because the early questions weren't casual, they were reconnaissance dressed as concern. The pattern is consistent across disaster behavioral research. Individuals who begin resource-focused conversations before deprivation actually sets in are operating on a different psychological timeline than the rest of the neighborhood. They've already accepted scarcity before scarcity has arrived. And that kind of premature survival mindset doesn't produce cooperation. It produces calculation. So, when the lights go out and someone walks over within the first few hours asking what you've got, what you've prepared, how long you can hold out, don't mistake that for friendliness. That's a scouting mission. And you just became a point on their map. Number 9. The neighbor who volunteers too much help. This one sounds counterintuitive, and that's exactly why it works. In the early phase of a blackout, there's always one neighbor who becomes aggressively generous. They're offering to share batteries. They're checking on every household. They're organizing, directing, volunteering for everything. And on the surface, it looks heroic. But experienced disaster analysts recognize this behavior for what it often is: social positioning for future leverage. Sociologists studying post-crisis community dynamics identified a pattern called transactional altruism. It describes individuals who provide early visible assistance not out of pure generosity, but as an investment in social capital that they intend to cash in later. The help isn't free. It's a deposit into an unspoken debt system. And when things get worse, they come to collect. The mechanism is devastatingly simple. By helping you on day 1, they create an obligation. And by day 4, when they need something from you, that obligation becomes pressure. Quote 5. And if you refuse, you're not just saying no to a neighbor. You're betraying someone who helped you. That psychological trap is extraordinarily effective because it weaponizes your own gratitude. During the prolonged outages following the 2011 Joplin tornado, community case studies documented that some of the most intense neighbor-to-neighbor conflicts originated from perceived debts created during the initial cooperation phase. People who gave early expected to receive later, and when the return didn't match the investment, resentment escalated into confrontation. Not every helpful neighbor is running this calculation consciously, but the pattern is real, and the red flag isn't generosity itself. It's the scale and visibility of that generosity in the first hours, before it's even needed, because real helpers don't perform. They act quietly. The neighbor making sure everyone sees how helpful they are is building a ledger, not building community. Number 8. The neighbor who disappears completely. Now let's talk about the opposite behavior, and why it's just as dangerous. In every extended blackout, there are households that go completely silent. Doors shut, Curtains drawn. No contact. No response to knocking. Total withdrawal. And most people ignore them because they seem harmless. That's a mistake. Complete social withdrawal in the first 48 hours of a crisis is a recognized behavioral marker in threat assessment. Professionals call it defensive isolation, and while it sometimes indicates fear or introversion, it often indicates something else entirely. Hoarding behavior paired with territorial escalation. Research on residential crime during extended outages shows that households exhibiting early total isolation are disproportionately associated with two outcomes. Either they become victims because they've signaled vulnerability, or they become aggressors because their isolation was strategic, designed to protect stockpiled resources while monitoring the neighborhood from concealment. During the 2012 derecho storms that left millions without power across the mid-Atlantic, emergency responders noted that some of the most dangerous confrontations occurred at isolated homes, where residents had silently fortified and later responded to any approach with extreme hostility. Their withdrawal wasn't passivity. It was perimeter establishment. The red flag isn't that someone is quiet. It's that someone who was previously social, previously visible, previously engaged, suddenly becomes a ghost within hours of the outage. That behavioral discontinuity signals a dramatic internal shift. They've moved from neighbor mode to fortress mode. And people in fortress mode don't distinguish between threats and visitors. Everyone approaching their door is a potential enemy. The neighbor who disappears isn't necessarily planning to harm you, but they've already decided that you are no longer an ally. And that decision, made silently and early, makes them unpredictable. Unpredictable neighbors in a blackout are the ones that keep you awake at night, and they should. Number 7. The neighbor who starts keeping score publicly. Here's where the social fabric starts to tear in real time. Around day 3, someone on the block will begin vocalizing comparisons. We haven't eaten since yesterday, but they seem fine over there. Must be nice to have a generator. Funny how some people prepared and didn't bother telling anyone. This is scorekeeping, and it's one of the most dangerous social behaviors in a collapsing neighborhood. Psychologists classify it as distributive injustice signaling, the deliberate public articulation that resources are unfairly distributed. And the purpose isn't observation, it's recruitment. When someone keeps score out loud, they're not just expressing frustration. They're building a coalition. They're testing who agrees. They're identifying allies for future action. And every person who nods along becomes a member of an informal grievance group that now has a shared target. Whoever appears to have more. Research on collective mobilization during civil disturbances has consistently shown that verbal resource comparison is one of the strongest precursors to group-level aggression in residential settings. It's the narrative phase. Before people act, they build a story that justifies the action. And scorekeeping is how that story gets written. During extended blackouts in Argentina's recurring grid failures, neighborhood-level reporting showed that open verbal comparison between households preceded nearly every documented instance of collective resource confrontation. The pattern is almost mechanical. First comes observation, then comes vocalization, then comes consensus, then comes action. The neighbor who starts saying things like, quote 9 or quote 10 is not making small talk. They're laying emotional infrastructure for something bigger, and by the time you recognize it, the narrative has already solidified. You're no longer a neighbor. You're a hoarder. You're selfish. You're the reason they're suffering. And that story is far more dangerous than any individual threat, because stories move groups, and groups move against targets. Number 6. The neighbor who tests boundaries with small violations. Let me hit you with something that security professionals understand but civilians almost never catch in time. Before someone betrays you in a significant way, they test you with a small one. It's called boundary probing, and it's one of the most reliable pre-attack indicators in threat behavior analysis. In a blackout, it looks like this: a neighbor walking into your yard without asking, someone opening your gate to quote _11 a person you barely know trying your car door handle with a casual excuse, kids from down the street wandering into your garage. Small actions that individually seem harmless, but collectively represent a systematic erosion of your territorial boundaries. Criminal behavioral profiling shows that home invasion and residential theft almost always follow a probing sequence. The perpetrator doesn't start with the crime. They start with a test. They observe how you react to a minor intrusion. If you say nothing, the boundary moves. If you rationalize it as innocent, the boundary moves again. Each unanswered probe confirms that your defenses are social, not physical, and social defenses collapse under sufficient pressure. During extended outages following Hurricane Harvey, law enforcement reports documented that many residential break-ins were preceded by days of incremental boundary violations from individuals known to the victims. A borrowed tool that wasn't returned, an uninvited visit to _quote_12_A, casual walkthrough of a driveway that wasn't theirs. Each event was small enough to dismiss. Together they formed a reconnaissance chain. The neighbor who tests your fence line on day 2 is measuring your response on day 2 so they know your weakness on day 6. That's not paranoia. That's documented criminal preparation behavior adapted to a crisis environment. If someone starts treating your space as theirs before the situation gets desperate, they are telling you exactly what they'll do when it does. Number 5. The neighbor who forms alliances against specific households. This is the one that turns a blackout from inconvenient to genuinely threatening. Around day 4 or 5, something shifts in the social geometry of the block. Conversations stop being open and start becoming clustered. Small groups form. Whisper networks activate. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that certain households are being discussed while others are doing the discussing. This is alliance formation. And in disaster sociology, it's considered one of the final stages before targeted group action. Researchers call it exclusionary coalition building. It occurs when a subset of the community identifies an outgroup, typically households perceived as having disproportionate resources, and begins coordinating a shared narrative and, eventually, a shared strategy. The mechanism is tribal. When stress is high and resources are low, humans default to in-group and out-group categorization. And in a blackout, the in-group becomes us, the ones who are suffering, and the out-group becomes them, the ones who seem fine. Once that division solidifies, everything your household does gets reinterpreted through an adversarial lens. Your closed curtains become secrecy. Your quiet house becomes evidence of hidden abundance. Your refusal to share becomes proof of selfishness. During extended post-disaster conditions and multiple documented events, this coalition pattern preceded nearly every instance of organized neighborhood-level resource seizure. It's not a mob. It's more calculated than that. It's a deliberate social structure built to justify and coordinate collective action against a specific target, and the terrifying part is that it's invisible from the outside until it activates. You won't see it forming. You'll only see the result. A group at your door with demands, with a shared story, and with the collective courage that no individual among them would have alone. Number 4. The neighbor who starts monitoring your movements. Here's the behavior that crosses the line from social tension to active threat. And most people don't recognize it until it's already well advanced. In an extended blackout, boredom becomes surveillance. People have nothing to do except watch, and watching becomes habitual, then intentional, then targeted. The red flag is the neighbor who begins tracking your patterns. When you come outside, when you check your vehicle, when your lights appear, when your door opens, when you carry things in or out. You might catch them glancing from a window. You might notice them sitting on their porch at unusual hours, always facing your direction. You might feel watched without seeing anyone specific. Behavioral threat assessment professionals call this fixated observation, and it's one of the strongest precursors to targeted action in residential threat environments. The observer isn't just curious. They're building a behavioral model of your household. They're learning your rhythm so they can exploit the gaps. During the extended outages from Superstorm Sandy, police departments in affected areas reported a significant increase in what they classified as pre-criminal surveillance behavior. Residents systematically observing neighboring homes prior to attempted break-ins. And the critical detail was this: the observation period often lasted 2 to 3 days before any action occurred. The neighbor wasn't impulsive. They were patient. They studied the target, and then they moved during the window they'd identified through watching. If you notice someone paying abnormal attention to your household during a blackout, that is not idle curiosity. That is operational planning in its early phase. They're mapping your schedule. They're identifying when the house is most vulnerable. They're calculating risk. And the fact that they're doing it openly from their own porch, from their own yard, makes it almost impossible to confront, because it looks like nothing. It looks like a neighbor sitting outside. But the direction of their attention tells you everything you need to know. Number 3. The neighbor who weaponizes children or elderly family members. Let me tell you something that sounds manipulative because it is. In extended blackouts, some households deploy their most sympathetic members as negotiation tools. The elderly mother who knocks on your door asking for water. The child sent to your house to say they're hungry. These aren't random events. They're strategic social pressure designed to exploit your empathy and bypass your defenses. It's extraordinarily effective because refusing a child or an elderly person triggers deep guilt mechanics that override rational resource management. Behavioral economists studying crisis negotiation tactics found that the use of vulnerable proxies in resource requests increases compliance by a staggering margin compared to requests made by able-bodied adults. The person sending their child to your door knows exactly what they're doing. They know you'll find it nearly impossible to say no to a 7-year-old with tears in their eyes. And once you give, they know the channel is open. Tomorrow it will be the child again, with a slightly larger request. Then a neighbor will accompany the child. Adding social pressure to emotional pressure, the escalation follows a documented pattern called sympathy ratcheting, where each successful emotional appeal raises the baseline for the next request. And here's where it turns dangerous. If you eventually refuse after establishing a pattern of giving, the narrative flips. You become the person who turned away a hungry child. That story spreads, and suddenly, you're not the generous neighbor who helped. You're the heartless one who stopped. That reputational damage becomes social ammunition for the alliance builders from number 5. Everything connects. The child at your door isn't just a child at your door. It's the opening move in a social chess game that can end with your household being collectively targeted. Watch for it. The family that sends their most vulnerable members to make requests is not asking for help. They're executing a strategy. And if you don't recognize it, you'll be feeding the entire block by day 6 with nothing left for your own family by day 8. Number 2. The neighbor who suddenly becomes your best friend. This red flag hides in plain sight because it feels good. There's always one person on the block who, the moment the blackout starts, suddenly treats you like family. They've never been this warm before. They bring over a small gift unprompted. They share personal stories. They ask about your kids by name. They create an intensity of connection that didn't exist 72 hours ago. And it feels genuine. That's the danger. Social psychologists call this crisis bonding acceleration. And while it can be authentic, it's also one of the most common manipulation frameworks observed in extended deprivation scenarios. The pattern works because humans are wired to reciprocate warmth. When someone is vulnerable and kind to you simultaneously, your guard drops. You share information you normally wouldn't. You reveal your supply situation. You show them parts of your house you'd keep private. You trust them because the emotional intensity of a crisis makes every connection feel deeper than it actually is. Intelligence professionals have a term for this: rapport-based elicitation. It means extracting information through relationship rather than interrogation. And in a blackout, it's devastatingly effective because nobody suspects the person who's being nice. Documented case studies from extended infrastructure failures show that households compromised by trusted-seeming neighbors frequently reported that the relationship escalated unnaturally fast during the crisis period. The person went from acquaintance to confidant in 48 hours, and every conversation during that bonding phase was quietly building an intelligence profile. What food do you have? Where do you keep it? How many people are in the house? Who's awake at night? When do you sleep? All extracted through friendly conversation, all weaponized later. The neighbor who suddenly becomes your best friend during a blackout might be genuine, but the timing is suspicious. And in survival scenarios, suspicious timing deserves suspicious attention. Number 1. The neighbor who talks about what's fair. This is the most dangerous signal of all, and it's the one hiding inside the most reasonable-sounding language. When a neighbor starts framing the blackout in terms of fairness, you are hearing the final warning before action. Quote 16. Quote 17. Quote 18. These statements sound moral. They sound community-minded. They sound like the right thing to say. But in the context of a prolonged blackout, they are the rhetorical foundation for forced redistribution. And forced redistribution, historically, is the civilized term for organized taking. Political psychologists who study resource language during crises found that fairness framing is the single most effective justification mechanism for collective property violation. It works because it reframes theft as justice. It reframes your preparation as greed. It reframes their taking as correction. And it recruits bystanders because nobody wants to publicly oppose fairness. The person invoking fairness isn't asking for a conversation. They're issuing a moral ultimatum. Share voluntarily, or we'll decide you're the villain and act accordingly. And the group will follow because the narrative has already been set. During documented post-disaster breakdowns, fairness language preceded collective resource seizure in a remarkably consistent pattern. The vocabulary is always the same: fair share, community responsibility, equal distribution, nobody should hoard. These phrases are not philosophy. They're operational language. They signal that someone has already decided your supplies belong to the group and they're building the moral architecture to take them. The neighbor who talks about fairness during a blackout isn't building community. They're building a case, and you are the defendant. By the time they've convinced enough people that equity demands action, your door isn't a boundary anymore. It's an obstacle, and that's the terrifying clarity a blackout provides. It doesn't change your neighbors. It reveals them. Every red flag on this list exists in your neighborhood right now, dormant, invisible, buried under mortgages and Monday routines and the comfortable fiction that the person across the street would never cross certain lines. But they will, not because they're monsters, because they're mammals. And mammals under sustained resource pressure follow patterns that are as old as the species and as predictable as gravity. The lights go out and every social mask comes off. The question isn't whether your neighbors will show you who they really are. The question is whether you're paying attention when they do.